Hello, in this screencast presentation I'm going to be talking through some of the key issues that connect health and housing from a planning perspective. There are lots of intersections in the field of health and housing, and there's a very broad literature on this subject. So I'm going to discuss some of the kind of key issues here, but I would also encourage you not only to look at the two key texts that I have referenced at the end of the presentation, but also to explore some of the wider kind of theoretical, conceptual issues, as well as some of the more focused issues. So the range of issues that connect housing and health kind of range everything from sort of the condition of the housing, the behaviours within the housing, the socioeconomic conditions of the people living in the housing, and the impacts that that has on their housing choices. It's most important to recognise that when we're talking about health and housing, we're continuing the theme from previous weeks, which is really connected to the socio-spatial determinants of health and the health inequalities that people experience as a result of their socioeconomic condition and where they live. The quote on the left, which I won't read out word for word, you can do that, is from one of the key texts referenced at the end. It just summarises really the key issues for the UK context in relation to health and housing is sort of largely attributed to the age of the housing stock. So we have one of the oldest housing stocks in Europe, certainly, and we have the combination of a dense population and a very old housing stock that is in complex tenure in terms of who owns the properties, who lives in the properties. So yeah, that's really one of the key issues is around the UK context is how we deal with a very, very old and quite often poorly maintained housing stock. One of the first issues I want to draw your attention to is that of indoor air quality. This is discussed in lots of technical detail in one of the key texts for supporting the presentation. But indoor air quality is not something that is as commonly discussed as sort of, well, increasingly these days, the air quality outside. So indoor air quality is one of the key determinants of health that relates to housing. And there are lots of things that contribute to poor indoor air quality. A lot of those are related to the condition of the property, but some are also related to the behaviours that take place within the property. So whether people smoke or whether people have pets, but also to do with the condition, the ventilation, the levels of humidity, the damp, chemical pollutants from sort of outdated pipe systems or electrical systems or paints or that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different things that can contribute. But the indoor quality is also influenced by the outdoor air quality. So the two things are connected. So as much as it's determined by the things that are happening within the building, the location of the building, because obviously the air from outside comes in and circulates. So there are, you can have a real concentration, literally, of different kinds of environmental factors that contribute to the interior air quality, which has a major impact on health on lots of different levels, like respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular illnesses, skin irritations, allergies, that kind of thing. The next key issue I want to draw your attention to is that of fuel poverty. Again, there is a large body of literature discussing fuel poverty. So fuel poverty itself is a contested term. So I've chosen sort of a simple definition from the book chapter reference at the end of the presentation. Fuel poverty occurs when a low-income household cannot pay for the energy services that it needs from a reasonable proportion of income. So it's really to do with the cost of the fuel costs in relation to your income. What this obviously doesn't quite capture are households where the income levels mean that although the building's very inefficient in terms of its the fabric of the building, it takes a lot of heating and a lot of energy, that if the person can afford that, they wouldn't count as fuel poor. And that really is kind of another issue around sort of environmental sustainability that we'll discuss later on in the module. But this issue of fuel poverty really affects people on low incomes, because what happens is obviously that people then don't heat their homes, or they don't in other parts of the world where cooling, you have cooling technologies, they don't keep their homes cool. So this is really about the health impacts of not being able to maintain a healthy temperature in the home. And the chart included on this slide just shows the UK performance in relation to some other countries within Europe. So we are, we have a higher level of fuel poverty than is commonplace within Europe, and it's a particular issue. And again, that relates often to the thing I mentioned on the previous slide, which is the aging condition of the housing stock. So what we tend to have, you'll have lots of people on relatively high incomes in very old buildings, but they wouldn't count as fuel poor because they can afford to heat those very inefficient old buildings. But you have an awful lot of people living in those smaller, very old terraced houses, or examples of older housing where they're actually not able to maintain a healthy temperature, and that has lots of health implications. So as well as the age of the housing stock being a structural driver, it's also important to recognise, and this is where there is a connection between some of the UK housing stock and the former sort of Eastern Bloc countries, the Eastern European countries, where there were enormous post-war state housing programs that made the post-war housing program in the UK look tiny by comparison. But what tends to happen in those large housing programs is that those houses, those properties, things like the tower blocks shown in the slide here, were built with sort of combined heating systems. That meant that there wasn't an expectation that the tenant would pay for their heating. It would all be integrated within the cost of the building, and often that meant that there were quite poor controls, and there wasn't really the opportunity for the tenant to control the heating because they weren't really paying very much for it, so it wasn't seen as necessary. That occurs also you have some social housing properties in the UK that are on district heating systems, or that are on heating systems that are, there's very little control by the tenant on the heating system. And that, when everything's working fine, and if there are lots and lots of subsidies for energy, that works okay. But as soon as you start to have a market-driven, an energy market that's on the open market, it's not being controlled by the state, and those prices are fluctuating, you also see people who are living in this kind of post-war housing stock that was built with these integrated heating systems having very little control and having very sort of poor experiences of being able to keep their properties warm or cool. Overcrowding is another key issue that, well, it's not obviously just a UK problem at all, it's a global problem in low-income communities, but it is a significant problem. And again, this is an issue that's linked to affordability, availability, and tenure in terms of housing. So quite often people who find themselves in overcrowded properties do so because they don't have any choice about where they're living. They can't afford to move to a bigger property, and they are in a system that determines what size property they're able to live in. So things like a shortage of larger social housing properties, or people living in private rented properties that aren't as regulated, often leads to overcrowding. And you've probably heard of lots of kind of examples of overcrowded properties within your own areas of work. So overcrowding, whether obviously too many people living in the property for that would not comply with space standards, there are multiple implications there, both in terms of physical health and mental health. So the concentration of people within a small space obviously exacerbates anything around transmittable diseases. It's shown to have implications for respiratory diseases, cardiovascular, but also lots of mental health implications. So it causes additional stress, anxiety, and can lead to depression. And one of the things I just want to flag up, and this is 2021 when I'm recording this, so the current COVID lockdown restrictions that we have now been experiencing on and off for almost a year have really highlighted and exacerbated the issue of overcrowding. So examples would, people obviously haven't been able to leave their homes for certain periods of time. Quite often the overcrowded properties won't have very big gardens, as well as being overcrowded. There's no private outdoor space to go to. They'll tend to be in areas with relatively low levels of public green space. And also things like very specific issues, like things like homeschooling and working from home. So people living in overcrowded properties on low income are less likely to have the kinds of jobs where they can work from home. But children who are living in overcrowded properties and are trying to, participate in homeschooling are at a serious disadvantage. They don't have anywhere to work, even if they do have access to the right equipment to be able to participate. They often don't have space to be able to participate properly in things like homeschooling. So the current situation is really exacerbating and drawing attention to this particular issue of health inequality related to housing. So a lot of the issues that I've been talking about so far relate to the kind of the interior spaces, either the condition or the size, the behaviours that take place within there, and all those kinds of things, and how they intersect in terms of health implications. But obviously, the connection between health and housing doesn't just sort of end at the front door. So when we talk about health and housing, we are also including neighbourhood factors. So we know that there's again a huge body of literature on what a healthy neighbourhood looks like, and I think sometimes the healthy neighbourhood literature tends to focus more on the design and layout and service provision within a neighbourhood, and sometimes doesn't tackle those other issues of the actual condition of the housing, the size and condition and tenure, and choices around the housing itself. So I wanted to put those first, but it doesn't mean that these aren't important factors too. So as I mentioned, a well-designed neighbourhood is important. So you ideally want a neighbourhood that supports people being able to walk and play and spend time outside and move between their home, their place of work, and the different services that they need, schools, medical facilities, shops, that kind of thing, in ways that are healthy. So engaging in active travel, walking, cycling, etc., if that's possible. It's good for the neighbourhood to have clean air, and that is, again, we've talked about the interior air quality issues, but that is heavily influenced by exterior air quality as well. So if you live in a neighbourhood that's got really poor air quality because it's either close to areas of industry or heavy traffic or both, then that's a significant problem. The social stresses are really important. So living in an area where you feel safe, where you're not constantly feeling anxious about risk, like risk, fear of crime, or risk of harm within your neighbourhood. It's a really important factor. So again, this is this intersection of mental and physical health. They are not separate issues; they're entirely related. There are also, it's important to recognise that when we talk about having a neighbourhood that has good access to employment on foot and on bike, it's also important to recognise the nature of employment and how different types of jobs have different health implications as well. So the work should also ideally be supporting decent health. So it should not be precarious. It should be reasonably well paid, and it shouldn't involve excessive kind of physical strain. And as we know, again, many people on lower incomes do not have the choice about whether or not their work makes them healthy or makes them ill. So when we're thinking about design, let's not also forget that we're talking about the quality of the elements as well, not just is there work nearby, but is it good work, and is it work that supports good health and well-being. Likewise with education, it's important to have good educational facilities that are accessible and of a decent quality in the area. But most of the issues that we talk about in this module in terms of health inequalities and addressing the relationship between planning and health, we're always talking about low-income groups. It's very, very often we're focusing on the areas of multiple deprivation. So we should not forget that really its income level is a key determinant of good health. So we should also be looking at opportunities to increase income levels or produce more secure income levels for people who are in areas that experience low health outcomes. And the final term, agency, I mentioned this in reference to the key reading for this week. And agency is this sense of how much control, how much power and control do you have over different elements of your life? Can you choose where you live? Can you choose how to look after the home that you live in? Can you choose what job you do? Can you choose how you get to work and how you get your children to school? And do you have any power to control any of these elements? So often we talk about this is what a healthy lifestyle looks like, but lots of people are excluded from having a healthy lifestyle because through no fault of their own, they lack agency. Either they have disabilities that make participation difficult, they are on income levels that make participation difficult, or there's lots of other complicated factors. So we also need to look at, when we talk about, presenting people with the opportunities for a healthy lifestyle, what barriers exist that stop people from being able to participate equally. So before we finish the presentation, we will discuss briefly this week, but also in future weeks, the role of planning in relation to health and housing. And obviously there are lots of ways in which the profession of planning and planners can inform and influence this relationship between health and housing. Everything from sort of strategic and spatial policies and plans around, developments, master planning, land use planning, deciding, where to locate different kinds of land uses, transport planning, ensuring there's a healthy transport infrastructure, but also thinking about the kind of toolkits that exist for planners in terms of assessing proposals for developments. So things like the health impact assessment process that is referenced in this graphic here would represent one of the toolkits that planners have. How effective they are and how well used they are and how much power and influence they have is obviously up for discussion. There's a lot of literature on this subject as well, and that's something that we'll be looking at. But do the tools exist for planners to be able to improve health outcomes through the role and remit of planning? And that's a big discussion for us to have. And also, obviously, whilst there is a push to start increasing the amount of social housing that's being built, the majority of house building in the UK at the moment is not, it's not social housing. So there also needs to be processes for partnership working with housing providers, thinking also about processes of retrofitting and updating the housing stock. So some big discussions to be had, some big issues there for planning, and be interested to get your perspectives on those. So I hope this has been a useful summary overview. Obviously, I can only introduce some of those key subjects and direct you towards the themes in the literature, and we'll be discussing these in class. But housing and health is a very complex intersection of issues at a number of different scales, from individual agency, individual behaviours, family behaviours, all the way up to the kind of wider physical environment, economic environment, social environment within which people live. And there are a number of different ways that that planners can work and influence within those different spheres and those different scales. But the most important thing to recognise, I think, that if we're talking about health, then housing is probably one of the key drivers, if not the key driver, in determining health outcomes. And one of the key issues when we look at those health inequalities is the quality of the houses that people live in and the location of those houses. So where we live is probably one of the most important factors, and therefore we can't shy away from it, and we need to look at that complexity and try to think how we could maybe work better to improve those health outcomes through housing improvements. As I said, there's a wide literature on this. This is just two texts, but the module textbook, the Routledge Handbook of Planning for Health and Wellbeing, has excellent chapters looking at both specific issues around housing and health, but also a general overview. So chapters 19 and 28 in particular I'm recommending. And then the other paper is the key reading for the class this week, which talks about some of those overarching issues and goes into a bit more detail as well. So I hope that's been helpful. Thanks for listening. Bye.